Ever since the Migrant Compact and the Refugee Compact were both signed by the UK government as well as a plethora of other countries worldwide, mainly European of course, who else would it be, there's been a severe reduction in the amount of news and coverage in relation to migration and refugees. It's not completely and utterly devoid of this information, the internet that is, but you have to kind of go out of your way to find any of the news that may or may not be out there on the matter yourself. And that's how I stumbled across this. And there was protests taking place in regards to asylum seekers having their locks changed, or there was supposed to be lock changes occurring as a means to evict them. But what I found remarkable about the protests at the time, the coverage in relation to the so-called breach of human rights, and again the same here too, is the fact that these people are failed asylum seekers, and instead of questioning why these people are still here, we seem to be focusing on the unlawful and inhumane treatment of these people. So it goes on to say here, for example, that the lock change evictions of asylum seekers, failed asylum seekers, bit of a difference, without court orders are lawful, the inner house of the Court of Session has ruled, whose implications have been described as deeply concerning. Upholding the judgment, judges said the Home Office contractor did not act unlawfully by issuing eviction notices in Glasgow last year. They were handed eviction notices and yet they still didn't vacate the premises. You know, so not only are they failed asylum seekers, completely and utterly outstaying their welcome for all intents and purposes, they too ignore eviction notices. Then when action gets taken, it's racist, it's inhumane, you know. Circle was forced to pause the evictions of more than 330 asylum seekers, failed asylum seekers, after the legal challenge was made. Mr. Ali had no lease and paid no, Miss Ali, had no lease and paid no rent, making her occupation of the property precarious. The Lord Justice Clerk stated that the agreement under which she occupied the property made clear that her occupancy was temporary, for the limited duration of the period during which her asylum claim was being assessed. And I presume it's been assessed since then, and she was still in the property, which is why she was evicted, or there was moved to evict her. Once the claim was assessed, the agreement provided for determination of the right to occupy on a service of written notice. Fiona McPhail, Principal Solicitor of Shelter Scotland, said that this decision is deeply disappointing news for all those directly affected. We now face a situation where around 300 people will be at risk of summary eviction with no right to homeless assistance or no right to work to earn their own income to cover rent. Why would they be granted work to be able to earn income to then be able to afford themselves rent when they are failed asylum seekers? If you went down this path, what would be the difference between them and an asylum seeker who had an application accepted? You can't reward these people for staying in the country longer than they should be here for. If anything, there really should be questions being directed in regards to why is there nothing being done to get them out of the country? As sad as that may sound, if they've had their claim rejected, I don't really understand why they are still here. The finding that Circle is not a public authority and therefore does not need to comply with the Human Rights Act is deeply concerning. It's the state that has the statutory obligation to accommodate asylum seekers. You don't have to accommodate asylum seekers. It might not be illegal to claim asylum in a country, but it doesn't mean you are obligated to accept everybody that tries that. But if by privatising those services the state can avoid its obligations under human rights law, this sets a dangerous precedent, and the alternative would have set an even more dangerous precedent, I would have thought. They would just come over here knowing full well that if their application was rejected, they could still stay anyway. It kind of defeats the purpose. Solicitors in the case said they would be seeking their client's permission to appeal the ruling at the UK Supreme Court, which it must do within 28 days. Alongside immigration, homelessness and human rights campaigners, the solicitors have raised particular concerns about the court's decision that Circle was acting as a private company. Solicitor advocate and principal solicitor Gavin Law Centre said that this was truly a sad day for Scotland and for human rights, and the ruling meant that Circle can effectively take the law into its own hands. He said, allowing the Home Office's cross-appeal, the effect of today's ruling is that UK government can outsource its statutory and international legal obligations to a private company. Raised by the Commission in the case were that Circle's lock change policy could breach the right to private home and family life protected by Article 8 of the European Convention on Human Rights. Robertson added that the court had made a welcome recognition of the need for sufficient and procedural safeguards, but said that the Commission remained concerned that the people affected, who are already in precarious and vulnerable situations, face an unnecessarily heavy burden when it comes to accessing their human rights. Our clients are continuing to progress their asylum claims and cannot return to their country of origin. But we're also talking about people who have outstayed their welcome in the sense that we're also people who have had their claims rejected, some having their claims rejected as far as early on last year, but yet they're still here. The ruling described a candidate for Glasgow North, Paul Sweeney, who was the MP at the time when the general election being called, joined with campaigners and individuals affected by the decision, where he pledged to take action. This necessity emergent legislation if there was a progressive majority in the UK Parliament after the next election. I can only speak for the Labour Party's position, but we will certainly be seeking to remove all private sector involvement in the asylum seeker process as a first step, and to ensure that it's based on the idea of human dignity, to ensure there are no summary evictions, and to ensure that there is no cooling off period in which no one will be made destitute. Sweeney added that, as agreed by members at the party's autumn conference, a Labour government would close all immigration detention centres from day one. He emphasised that there will be no immigration detentions and no imprisonment in what are effectively concentration camps. This will not happen. Effectively concentration camps. I mean, you should not be elected as a public representative when you're making comparisons that are as fucking brain dead as that. SNP candidate for Glasgow South West, Chris Steffens, also an MP before the elections, also met with campaigners expressing concern that a private company awarded a public contract should be exempt from human rights. In the event I'm re-elected, I will certainly be looking at changing the law in that regards. If I'm re-elected, I'll introduce my asylum accommodation bill to ensure that no asylum seeker is evicted without going for a court or tribunal process. But that's Scottish Green leader, oh god, Patrick Harvie also responded, describing the UK's approach to asylum as inhumane. Of course he did. Patrick Harvie, that thinks that the idea of Brexit's far right and that Scotland needs to become a communist society and implement a Green New Deal, are all going to die in 10 years. Are they going to take on board what Patrick Harvie has to say in the matter when it comes to coming to your own conclusions on the matter? The court has ruled that the actions were illegal, but that does not make them right. This decision simply shows that current laws are not fit for purpose. Have you not got a climate emergency to tackle, son? A vote for the Greens is a vote to reject the Tories' approach and put dignity and capacity at the heart of how Scotland deals with those seeking safety on our shores. And after they have had their claims rejected, hypothetically, then what? Because that's what we are talking about here. Local spokesperson Julia Roberts said that for 18 months we have been supporting people whose asylum claims have failed, providing free accommodation and utilities. We have listened to the public's concerns that the process to take back the properties they were living in might be unfair or illegal, but we now have a clear judgment from the Scottish highest court that our approach is completely proper and within the law. During this time, Circle has been demonised and subject to extreme criticism by the bampots that seem to dominate the left wing in Scotland, and the fact that we have spent millions of pounds supporting people who no longer have a right to remain in the UK and provide them with free accommodation has been widely ignored. And again, I want to know why they're still here. We will be working with the authorities in the Sheriff's Court to ensure an orderly, sensitive application of the law. I don't know what's going to come of this if a bunch of progressive lefties get into Parliament in the upcoming election. They're going to use the outrage generated from this story here and make it so it's a lot more difficult to not only evict these people who have outstayed their welcome, but it wouldn't surprise me if we teeter that little bit closer to making it near enough a breach of human rights to fail an asylum application.